Hey everyone, in this video we're just going to do some 2D list review before we move on to the next section. You can find this code up on my GitHub and my Python repo, and it is 052dlist.py. So let's get started. The very first thing is just how to create a 2D list. First thing you need to know is that it doesn't have to be a square, so it can be what you may consider a jagged list, or what would be a jagged array in another programming language. You can access each of the elements indexing just like normal, so you can print grades as 0, which is actually going to be a list itself, and you can check the type using type, and you can see it returns list. If you want to grab one of the elements within that list, you just need to do another set of square brackets. So we're grabbing the element with index 1, which will grab this element right here, and it appears right here in the terminal. Lists are dynamic, so you can append another element to the main list, and we can also rearrange data with popping. That's going to remove an element, and that's going to shift indexes, just as a side note, so just be careful there. See, now when we print grades, it has a different structure. So we popped index 1, which gets rid of this list right here, and we added a list of 4, which comes at the end there. So this is the final structure. Next up, we talk about the length of grades versus the length of grades index 0. The length of grades is the outer list, so we're going to get 3 because there's 3 lists inside of here. When we get length of grades 0, we're also going to get 3 because it's now getting the length for this list inside of it. You can use the length for iterating through it, or you can just use a for loop by saying for inner list in grades, for grade in inner list, and then you can print that data, so you're going to get some output like this right here. It'll break if one of the elements is not a list. You could do a check if you want to, so you can do that with something like this, is instance, and then put the list you're wanting to check, and then checking to see if it's a list. So that's just an example of how to do that here, which we get a similar output, which is where this output right here comes from, coming from this list here. If you're iterating using range, that's where that length can come in. So taking a look at the next section of code, we're using the length of the outer list, and then for each iteration, we get the length of grades of index I. So you use that outer variable inside in the inner for loop, and that'll give us this output here, which comes from this list here. We took this code and we pretty much wrapped it inside of a function. So here's how you could create a function to print a 2D list. We then show an example of invoking this by passing in a list. We have some individual elements that are just strings, and then we have 2 lists of numbers, and you can see all the output right here. Since we're doing that checking to see if it's a list, it's not breaking when we pass in an individual element that's not in a list, which is nice. Next up, we have some other junk in here. Let's figure out what this comes from. We got some join, so we have these strings, and the very first situation we're joining it with a dot, which is where these dots come from. This is the opposite of splitting data. We're now putting data back together, so we take a list and put it into a string. Then I have a situation of joining data of different types, and here's how you do something like that, which I stole from this Stack Overflow question if you're interested. And sorting a 2D list, that's what we talked about next. By default, it sorts element by element. It's going to put all of the first elements that are lower at the beginning, and if there's any conflicts, it'll look at the second element. So printing this data, we get this here. 4 comes first before 7 or 10, and then in the situation where there's numerous 10s, it looks at the next element, so 2 comes before 20. Then I have some print statements just showing individual comparisons if you're interested, but I'm going to move on to using a sum of a list. So you can pass in a function to the key parameter. Don't put the parentheses again. And in this situation, it's going to sort by the sum of the list. So 10 is the smallest, then we have 15, then we have whatever that is, and then so forth. It just gets bigger and bigger. You can reverse the sort by saying reverse is equal to true. So that's going to give us this output here. Then we create a custom function, average, which actually takes the sum, divides it by its length. We have it printing it here if you're interested in the output. But for production, you probably don't want to do that, or you could just check it using debugging tools. However, printing it, that's the easiest way to check. So we print the data just so we can see it, and then we show that it sorts by this average here. So the one with the lowest average, which is this list here, that's going to come first. Then the next one, which is this one here, and so forth. So that is everything we talked about with 2D lists. Hopefully you understand all that at a pretty good level. You can now probably see that we're starting to build some more complex stuff, and it might get a little bit limited if we're just trying to do everything inside of one file. So the next logical thing to talk about is modules. That's what we're going to cover in the next section. We're going to learn how to work with modules, different ways of importing them, and then how to create our own modules for whatever projects we are working on. So stay tuned. I'm excited. Hopefully you are as well, and please be sure to subscribe.